In section 2.4, we're going to be talking about multiplying real numbers. There is one vocabulary word in this section, and that is the multiplicative identity. That is the number 1. And the reason the number 1 is the multiplicative identity is because the product of a and 1, so 1 times 1, is a. No matter what number you multiply by 1, you will still get that same number for your answer. And our first box is about the sign of a product. When you're multiplying two numbers, the sign that they have, that the answer has, depends on the numbers that you are multiplying. The product of two real numbers with the same sign is positive. Our examples: 5 times 2 is 10. Negative 4 times negative 5 is a positive 20. The product of two real numbers with different signs is negative. 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. Negative 8 times 4 is negative 32. In example 1, we are going to be finding the product of these numbers. Negative 7 times negative 23 will yield a positive 21. Because the signs are the same, the product is positive. In B, we have three numbers. 3 times 4 times negative 2. They started out with multiplying 3 times 4, which is 12. Then we do 12 times negative 2. We have different signs. Our answer will be negative. 12 times negative 2 is negative 24. And finally in C, 1/4 times negative 16 times negative 3. They started off with multiplying 1/4 and negative 16. Those have different signs. When you multiply 1/4 and negative 16, you get a negative 4. Then negative 4 times negative 3, same signs, our product is positive, and that is positive 12. In our first checkpoint, negative 4 times negative 6 is a positive 24 because both signs were negative. And in example 2, negative 3 times negative 2 is a positive 6, and a positive 6 times a negative 7 is a negative 42. If there are an even number of negative signs in the problem, 1, 2, the answer is positive. If there are an odd number of negative signs in the problem, 1, 2, 3, then our answer will be negative. Now we move into the properties of multiplication. Many of these properties are the same as the properties of addition that we learned back in section 2, but now they apply to multiplication. Some of them are new. The commutative property, just as in addition, the order in which the two numbers are multiplied does not change the product. So A times B is the same thing as B times A. 3 times 4 is the same thing as 4 times 3. The associative property has to do with grouping. Again, just like the multiplication property, but now with multiplication. A times B times C, A and B being grouped, is the same thing as A times B times C, with the B and the C being grouped. So if I group 2 and 3, I can take that 2 out and group the 3 and the 4, and that is the associative property. In the identity property, that is multiplying a number by 1 to get the same answer. So A times 1, same thing as 1 times A, is A. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2. So anytime you see that multiplication by 1, that's the identity property. The property of 0 says that when you multiply a number by 0, you get 0. So A times 0, same thing as 0 times A. Those are both the 0. 4 times 0 would be 0. And the last property, the property of negative 1, If you multiply a number and -1, you get the opposite of that number. So a times -1, same thing as -1 times a, will give you a negative a. -5 times -1 gives you a positive 5, the opposite of -5. In example 2, we're going to identify the property that is being illustrated by each expression. In A, 3 times 0 equals 0. That is the multiplicative property of 0. In B, t times 1 equals t. We see the times 1. That's the identity property of multiplication. In C, a times 3 is equal to 3 times a. That is the commutative property of multiplication. In N, we're changing how we group the numbers that are being multiplied. That is the associative property of multiplication. And in E, -7 times -1, we see the multiplication by -1, and that is the multiplicative property of -1. For our checkpoint, we will identify the property that is being illustrated. -4 times 0 equals 0. That is the multiplicative property of 0. In number 2, it's changing the order. Number 4. 6 times 2 equals 2 times 6. And that is the commutative property, and we are with multiplication here, so we have to say of multiplication. And number 5, we're changing how we group the numbers that are multiplied first. That is the associative property of multiplication. And finally, number 6, 4 times -1 is -4. We are seeing the multiplication by -1. That is the multiplicative property of -1. On our last page of notes, in example 3, we're going to take a multiplication problem and use properties to justify the steps that we take. So we start with 0.5 times -2x times 6. In the first part, we are going to switch the -2x and the 0.5. That is the commutative property of multiplication. Then we take and we group the 0.5 and the 6 together. Grouping has to do with the associative property of multiplication. Then we go ahead and we just multiply 0.5 and 6, and that gives us 3. That is just saying the product of 0.5 and 6 is 3. For our next step, we're going to switch the order of those two and put the 3 in front of the negative 2x. That is the commutative property of multiplication because we move them around. In our second to last step, we then group the 3 and the negative 2 together, pulling it out from the x, and that's the associative property of multiplication. And finally, you multiply the 3 and the negative 2 together to get negative 6, and then the x tags along, and that is simply the product of 3 and negative 2 is negative 6. In checkpoint number 7, we're going to find the product and justify our steps. We always start with the problem written by itself. We're going to say that it equals negative 1 times 3y, because what we did was we multiplied the negative 1/2 and the 2 together first. So our justification is just the property of the product of negative 1/2 and 2 is negative 1. Then we take and we group the negative 1 and the 3 together. So that's going to give us a negative 1 times 3 and then times y. And that's the associative property of multiplication. And our last step is to go ahead and multiply negative 1 and 3, and that gives us a negative 3y, and that's just the multiplicative property of negative 1. And that's our answer. And for our last problem, number 8, we have negative 2 times a times negative 5. We're going to start off by using the commutative property of multiplication so that we can get our numbers side by side. And that's going to leave us with a times negative 2 times negative 5. And that's the commutative property of For the next step, we're actually going to multiply negative 2 and negative 10, or negative 5, and that will give us a positive 10. So it's going to give us a times 10, and that is the product of negative 2 and negative 5 is 10. And our last step is just to move the 10 and the a, switch them around to make it 10a. And that is the commutative property of multiplication. And that concludes lesson 2.4.